is for you if you desire healing, wholeness, and freedom. Today on Healing Rain, we have author, podcaster, mom, Amy Debrucque. And part of what she is communicating to people is that you can live on purpose and not back down in fear. Well, today on Healing Rain, I have Amy Debrucque. And welcome to Healing Rain today.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Well, I know that God uses all of us, and we have all been on journeys with God. And can you share, where did your healing journey begin?
So it's always interesting when I start here because it seems like it would be just the opposite, but my healing journey really began about 12 years ago with a cancer diagnosis. I jokingly say now that when most people were planning their midlife crisis at 40, I had received a Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis. But what most people don't know is that up until that diagnosis, I had really been struggling with severe anxiety. And so fear was running my life all of those years up until that diagnosis. And the diagnosis for me was finally that opportunity to surrender and really just let God take that burden of fear. And so that's really where my journey began to start living.
Well, I can't imagine what all you walked through. So, there was a surrender, a pressing into God, but what did you have to walk through with that diagnosis?
Well, the diagnosis, I think just for anybody when you're faced with your own mortality it's a struggle. There's a lot of fear, but I had had two tragedies in my young adult life. So when I was 26, I had lost my oldest brother and our firstborn son within a matter of like 16 days of each other. So I wasn't new to news like that, but I had been waiting all of those years after and leading up to that diagnosis for the other shoe to drop. I was preparing and I was living in that constant state of what's going to happen next, what if, and just fueled with fear. And so the diagnosis, although almost seems like, gosh, that would fuel even more fear, right? But I was tired. I was worn out by then. The fear had taken over my life. If you saw me, you wouldn't necessarily know that. I was very private with my struggle. As a Christian woman, I felt almost ashamed that I couldn't figure it out, that my faith wasn't strong enough, which of course are all lies, but that's where I was. That was the place that I was in. And so I welcomed the surrender. And although, it's always scary after, I'm thinking, I had 4 more children and your first reaction is, I don't want to leave anybody behind. But I was more focused on living for the first time in my life. So that really is the pivot that kind of shifted everything for me.
So you began to live in hope because of this surrender?
I began just living in general for, I think when you're somebody who struggles with anxiety, your mind is just, I always try to use the analogy of being on that hamster wheel. It's just constantly in motion. I was rarely in the present. I have so many memories that I actually can't recall when my children were little because my mind needed to be in motion because the fear was so overwhelming to stay still. And so it allowed me to really just kind of be present and pay attention, listen to God's voice above my fears, above that constant being in motion. It taught me how to be still and just appreciate where I was. And, the reality is after that diagnosis, I had to go for quite a while, every 3 months to get a scan. And so in my mind, I had said, okay, I can live in 3-month increments. I will live, like in the present until the next scan and whatever that result's going to be. And so it became a discipline that I almost needed because I wasn't able to do it outside of that diagnosis.
Okay. Here's one thing I'm thinking about. Even when we prayed earlier, the scripture that came to my mind was from, I think it's 2 Timothy 1:7. God's not given us a spirit of fear, but a power and love and a sound mind. And what I like about that is it's talking about fear as a spirit. We struggle not against flesh and blood, but we struggle against principalities and powers.
Mm.
And, there's times like when I went to seminary, I went to a fairly liberal seminary that didn't believe that there were actual demons. Demons were seen as like a choice of alcoholism or something like that. And yet part of my freedom came when I realized there's a real struggle here. We have a real enemy. And so in that context, let me ask you, do you feel like you were plagued by a spirit of fear?
I think at the time, I wasn't able to see the spiritual warfare going on, but coming outside of it, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think part of the reason I stayed in it for so long is, like I said, I felt like I should figure it out. And there was a level of shame in being able to not figure it out. And that was the enemy speaking into me, and me, letting him speak
And
into
being
me.
in it, you're agreeing with it,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I can't figure it out. Right. And I'm still keeping, God in the passenger seat. And again, I think as women, sometimes when we are, um, we manage a lot of things, a lot of people. And so, I'm more of a control freak, or at least I was. I'm better now. But that was the way I ran. And so I was the person that people come to, but I was not the person, nor did I want to be the person that sought out support from somebody else. I didn't like the vulnerability piece. And so there was a level of pride that I think the enemy also spoke into me, that I latched onto. I wanted to be the one in charge of my healing. And when I couldn't do it, I like to say, Sue, that God, thank goodness, is such a gracious God. And he held up a lot of signs and signals leading up to that diagnosis, but I was a little slower than the average person catching on. So he was like, I'm going to have to really present something spectacular to get her attention. And so I really feel like it was a gift. I don't say that flippantly, because cancer is a big word. And there's times that, things come up and that fear can easily override quickly, but I have to just trust in his will and his timing for things, and what that reason is, even if I don't understand it.
Yeah. And we know that God doesn't bring about sickness or make
Right.
sickness happen or anything like that. We live in a fallen world.
Right.
And yet there are some very real things about constantly being under anxiety and fear. And I think I tell you, when I realized that there were actual spirits and that Christians could be spoken to it through thoughts in their minds, and because it's a thought, you just think it's your own thought. It so helped me, because that meant I don't have to agree with every thought that comes into my head. 2 Corinthians 10:3-5. I can take that thought and literally put it under my feet. But when you don't realize that the enemy works through your thoughts, it takes you captive. And so it's a very real struggle. And I think for me, understanding fear as a spirit that then taps into my human emotions.
Right.
And it's like a spirit can speak the thought, and then my human emotions kind of run with it,
Absolutely.
manifest it, live in it,
Yeah.
rehearse it, speak it with my mouth. And before you know, you feel this oppression that comes on you.
Absolutely. And I love the word captive that you used, because that's exactly the place I was in. I think that's where a lot of people find themselves when they're caught in that spirit of anxiety and fear. And you don't realize it. And sometimes you can't recognize it until you do step out of it. But like you said, your emotions, your feelings, all logic and truth goes to the wayside because you're so caught up in reacting to those lies and what that looks like and feels like. And the truth is, certain things are scary. It's a matter though of trusting God with whatever that is. And I agree with you. I don't think that God gives people cancer or gives people, tragedy and all of that. There's things that he allows in our lives. And I think that there's just different reasons for it, even if we don't understand it or if it doesn't make sense to us. And I think at some point too, for me and for other people that I've talked to, is that there has to be a reconciliation with that as well. There has to be, that I'm going to do my best. I'm going to respect my body as best as I can with what I'm doing with it, what I'm putting in it, and how I'm taking care of it. And then I have to just let it go and give the rest to you and be okay with knowing that I gave my best and whatever the rest is,
Right.
it's your will, not mine.
Right. And you know what I would add to that? I would add, I have a book coming out, I should tell you, Healing Rain, immersing yourself under Christ's love to find wholeness of body, mind, and heart.
Love that.
I think that what we're thinking and what we're feeling when we have toxic emotions of fear or dread or anxiety, I believe that those add to our heart emotions, and I believe that impacts our health. Not that we bring it on ourselves necessarily. And yet, when God made us, he made us body, mind, soul, spirit. They all interact. And so often when we have healing, taking that thought captive, of taking that lie, and putting it under our feet, that our emotional life is healed, then our physical life, it's part of the healing process of God.
Absolutely.
It's not a simple 1, 2, 3, but we're fiercely and wonderfully made by God. And he's made our thought condition to impact our health and our healing.
Oh, absolutely. I so 100% agree with that. And it is amazing. And this is one of the reasons when I share my story, I like to tell people listening that if you saw me on the street or at a school function or whatever, you wouldn't have known the internal struggle that I was facing. And I think that's important to tell and for people to be aware of, because even though I'm out on the outside, it looked like, oh, she, has it all together. But it affected me on so many levels beyond that I was broken physically. It may not have looked like I was physically broken, but it was the whole picture. And, just getting up and doing whatever my daily tasks were to do, like that was a huge accomplishment. Now, when I think about that, when you're out of it and you're on a different side of that, it fascinates me how debilitating that time was in my life with that spirit of fear resonating in me.
Well, and fear will keep you from obeying God. Fear will shut you in a very small world in a small cage. And it will keep you from following some of those things that take boldness in our life. When I was a young mom, I had traveled to the nations, had a heart for the nations, that I heard the Lord say, lay down your life for your kids. And not only will I send you to the nations, but your children as well. And so laying down my life for my kids, my kids as teenagers were traveling to the nations. Angela by 20 had gone to 10 nations. But I had forgot about that promise I had. And there I was, a Mimi, and I had an encounter with God where he called me to begin to travel internationally in the middle of COVID, in the middle of quarantine, in the middle of like nobody traveling because we were afraid of COVID.
Right. Yeah.
God said to me, now I want you to travel. And one of the things he said in my heart was, I want you to trample on fear when everybody is afraid. Now, of
Mm.
course, we went through all the testing and all
Sure.
everything we
Right.
did to travel. But I mean, those planes were completely empty when I
Yeah.
was first flying. Um, but one of the things, the reason I say that is God wants us to live a life where we believe him more
Mm.
than the report of the world.
Mm.
And recently I was headed to Kenya, and our flight went, I had never experienced this before, but the turbulence caused our plane to go, and
Oh
people were
gosh.
actually screaming. So they were
Oh.
screaming, and I've never been there. But
Hmm.
you know what happened to me? One, I knew I was headed to Kenya to preach the gospel. I thought of Paul in the shipwreck, and immediately I felt the Prince of Peace. I mean, I could feel God's presence. And
Right.
I started to pray out loud for everybody on the plane.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there was a woman in front of me, and I mean, her face was white. She was so afraid. She turned around, grabbed my hand, put my hand on her head, and had me pray for her. She was just so frightened.
Sure.
And we probably prayed and ministered for about an hour and a half because the turbulence lasted that long.
Oh, wow.
So it was a long period of time, but of course, everybody was safe and everybody was
Good.
fine. But, I say that because um, we all have choices of how to see reality,
Mm.
and how you see reality is going to impact how you feel.
Right.
So in my mindset, one, even if we went to heaven, I was great. But in my mindset, I knew I had a purpose to fulfill.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
And it made me fearless.
Mm.
So let me ask you this question, because we're dealing with the topic of fear. And really, I believe that in order to fulfill the fullness of your destiny, you need to, um, I want to be careful how I say this. Not that you might not feel the emotions of fear,
Right.
but you need to have fear under your feet to the degree that you can obey God
Right.
rather than your feelings. Can you
Absolutely.
speak to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, leading up to that whole experience and diagnosis, I was an extremely private person. I mean, I really still am. But at that time, shortly after, um, I had gone through treatment and all of that, and God was like really just on my heart, like you need to write, you need to share your story, you need to, let other women know of what you've gone through and all of that. And I was like, oh gosh, I cannot do that. I don't want people to know. I was still a little bit at that point of prideful, feeling a little embarrassed about it. And then you get the, what if they reject my words? What if they, and so it is a true act of obedience when we are stepping into something boldly and bravely that is not of our will, but is something that God is calling us to do. And so I can totally relate, whether it's being on a plane or hitting send on your first submission somewhere, your words getting it out. You have that same daunting, uneasiness, but you know that you are doing it for the right reason. You know, you have a purpose, and that's what gives you the courage to do it. And so it's interesting. My oldest daughter and I, we created an encouragement journal called Embolden. And the reason we did that was for that very reason, is that I think a lot of times we get hung up in those places and spaces where we get too comfortable, and we don't like having to step out of our comfort zone and do something that feels scary, even if it's not a cancer diagnosis or a turbulent plane ride. It could be something seemingly simple, but we get too comfortable, and then we aren't being obedient to what God is calling us to do. And so I think if we can equip women enough to take that first brave step, acknowledge, first of all, that your brave step is going to look totally different from your friends, from
Mhm.
anybody else's. It's unique to whatever God's calling you to do. It might not be what you're considering or viewing as this mountaintop experience, speaking in front of thousands. It could be you walking over to your neighbor and sharing a cup of tea and just fellowship with them. And you don't know what it looks like. What's most important is being obedient in whatever that calling is.
I think that's so great. I had a theme song at one point. I don't know if you know the song, You Make Me Brave. Have you ever heard that
Yes.
song?
Yeah.
So that became a theme song for me at a particular moment where I had had knee surgeries as an athlete in my 20s, and my knees just were terrible. I mean,
Mm.
I needed double knee replacement. I prayed about it. And I believe God said the miracles in the surgery, but that song became my theme song because I knew from others how much pain I was going to be putting myself in
Sure.
going through double knee surgery, both
Mm.
knees at the same time. But that was my theme song. It was like, you make me brave,
Mm.
because there are times that we do embrace the pain of the process because
Mhm.
God's leading us. And, I started to walk within 3 weeks. I mean, my recovery has been great.
Mm.
I'm able to exercise and travel and,
Yeah.
all of those things, no pain. It's miraculous.
Right.
But that song helped me
Hmm.
to walk through it. And I remember, and it was before COVID. And I remember thinking when people were dealing with quarantines and, surgeries. And I mean, we had that weird world for a while during
Sure.
the pandemic. And I was like, oh God, I'm so glad I didn't delay. I got that thing over and done with, that you made me brave.
Mm.
And I feel so thankful for it. Um, but we do need that encouragement um, from God and from others.
Hmm. And you know what? You mentioned this a little bit back in our conversation is how isolating fear can
Mhm,
make you, and it keeps your
mhm.
world so small. And that's actually what had happened to me is that, my world became smaller and smaller and smaller because I wasn't willing to share my vulnerabilities and what I was dealing with other believers, in which case they could have helped lift me up, encourage me, all of those things. You let fear win. You let that spiritual warfare wash over you so much that you're just shrinking. And so it is an interesting how your courage really can expand your world, and what that looks like, and how in just practical living what it actually is. I mean, staying home and just doing the basics, that's not going to get you to that next level. It's going to be reaching out uncomfortably sometimes and stepping into those things where the more you're stretching, the more you're growing. And it's just like with our kids, right? But it's different as adults. It's almost like sometimes I have to sit back and say, okay, if I'm having my kids, try out for things or whatever the case is, and it's that same type of discipline and practice. But as an adult, we don't necessarily look at it like that because we feel like we've made it to this point. But the reality is, I mean, I'm never going to make it, right? I mean, it's always going to be a journey of being uncomfortable, stretching past what I actually feel like I'm capable of doing, but what God would have me doing. And so, yeah, it's an interesting journey. But, since I made that pivot, it's been the most life-giving experience I've ever had.
And then it leads to more life-giving experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I read a book when I was dealing with fear that helped me. It was called Hind's Feet on High Places. Have you ever read that?
I have not.
Let me recommend it to you and
Okay.
recommend it to the Healing Rain. It's very old. Hind's Feet on High Places.
Okay.
And basically the main character is named Much Afraid.
Mm.
And she's a part of the fear family, and then it mentions dread, panic, and really this allegory describes her journey of healing with the shepherd, and that it really was the shepherd that had to pull the weed of fear out of her heart, and then she was able to give her life in service to others. And literally the picture was being like a deer that's able to be on high places with God, to be able to bound up, with
Yeah.
God. And what I love about that book and that allegory is she had two helpers on that journey, and they were on either side of her, and it was sorrow and suffering.
Oh, wow.
And if you
Yeah.
think about your life, it's a very similar thing, is that you were facing sorrow and suffering, but they were your guides to
Mm.
overcoming, and
Mm.
for you to be able to really overcome fear in your life.
Mm. I
Um,
love that.
it's powerful, isn't it? You'll love that book. You need to get it for your
Yeah.
daughter.
Very
Um,
powerful. And I love the idea of pulling the weed out,
mm,
the weed of fear.
oh yeah. And that it was only him that could do it.
Right.
There are times that things get wrapped around. And by the way, in talking about fear being a spirit, sometimes that goes in our family lines.
Mm.
The Bible will talk about familiar spirits. Part of it is you may have had a grandmother that was afraid and a mother that was afraid, and you can be influenced in your family line, and it can feel normal to you, and you may not even know that you need freedom from it. And that's true in areas of addiction or other types of places where people get stuck. Sometimes it's become so normal in our family experience, we don't know how to live differently.
Right. Oh, that's so true. And I think one of the best things for me and when I'm talking with other women is really addressing the root of the fear and
Mhm.
what are the common triggers that keep bringing you back to that fear. And I think you're right. A lot of times you could just say, well, I'm a worrier. My dad's a worrier. My
Mhm.
grandmother was a worrier, and the whole, and it almost can become a crutch as your default because it's like, well, that's the way I'm wired. But I do think that there is something to be said. And I think a lot of times, especially in the times that we're living in now, we're so busy. We have such a spirit of busyness, which is also, I think, part of our spiritual warfare that we're all dealing with, that we rarely take the time to invest in really uncovering and peeling back those layers of what is the root of this fear and why does it keep resurfacing? And if we would just take that time to really address it, do what we need to do with it, whether it's just talking to a mentor, whether it's something that's bigger and you need more counseling for that, whatever it looks like, doing that and then giving it to God and really handling it instead of putting a band-aid on it. I think too often also, and I'm talking just from my own personal experience because I know everybody's anxiety is different. And I did all the things, right? I was on medication at a point. I saw a therapist at a point. I mean, did Bible studies, all of that. And which is all great things. I was missing a bigger piece, which was putting God in control of all of it and really figuring out what was my real problem here. And my problem was I was afraid of something bad happening because that was my experience. And I just assumed it was going to, and that was going to be my destiny without giving him any credit or acknowledgement of whatever his will may or may not be. But living in a state of worry for me was like putting a band-aid on something, on a scratch that just never got healed. And so it just dragged out for so long because I never actually pulled that root out. And so I think I really appreciate that. Just the visual of that. If you could just get to the actual source of it and clean it out, that's when the
Yeah.
healing really begins.
And sometimes the root's from trauma. Sometimes
Sure.
the root is a lie that we're
Yep.
believing,
Right.
and when you get the root out, then you're able to move forward.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, as we close today, what are some things that you would like the Healing Rain listeners to know?
Mm. Well, one thing that I always say, because it's something that I think is just really important, a really important reminder when you're dealing with fear, is that recognizing that fear is normal, but courage does get the final say. And like you said, whether that's peeling back the layers, whether that's taking a moment to really address the root of your fears, but knowing that you're not alone, but it is possible to overcome.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely possible to overcome.
Yeah.
And it's something that sometimes I think people look at somebody that's bold and they think, wow, that must be your personality.
Mm.
It must be just who you are. But I remember I came from a pretty conservative background. I grew up Mennonite, but at 16, I knew that I was called to preach. And I'd never heard of a woman preacher. Maybe they're out in Africa somewhere, but you know, and people just think that I've always been bold. But the reality is, when you've not had role models to do something,
Mm.
I remember my hands would shake, my knees would shake. I
Mhm.
mean, I was so bound by fear. And
Right.
then fear ends up leading into other things, fear of rejection or fear of loneliness or fear of
Sure.
dread. I mean, it's just a whole thing.
Yeah.
But now I think people would look at me as though I'm bold.
Mm.
And here's the reality, and I love that you've got an Embolden journal, is that boldness does not mean that you're brash or harsh or pushy. Boldness means that you're coming into agreement with God's purposes. It's God's idea. And because your faith is not anchored in yourself, it's anchored in God. That's what makes you bold.
Right.
It's being on mission with God.
Yeah.
And so I pray that for everyone listening, that whatever you're called to do or to be, that you would not allow a spirit of fear to bind you or lie to you or encage you or trap you. That literally you would allow Jesus to rip that root out of your heart, and that you would be able to say that great big yes to God, that God, I'll go anywhere you want me to go. I'll do anything you want me to do. God, I just want to be in the center of your will for my life.